In the months immediately following the September 11th attacks, um, Americans were obviously terrified of commercial aviation.
Right. Completely understandably.
Yeah, I mean, the vivid, horrifying images of planes hitting the towers were just burned into the national consciousness. So millions of people made a choice that felt entirely logical to them at the time.
They canceled their flights.
Exactly. They canceled their flights and they decided to drive to their destinations instead.
Yeah.
Because driving felt safer, it felt familiar, and, most importantly, it felt like they were in control.
But the reality of that choice is staggering.
It really is. By choosing to avoid the incredibly statistically safe airline industry and putting themselves on the highway for millions of additional miles, they actually caused an estimated 1,500 additional completely preventable traffic fatalities in the year that followed.
Wow.
Yeah. They chose the deadlier option because their brain told them it was the safer one.
And that paradox right there is the absolute core of what we are unpacking today. We have this profound disconnect between objective risk, the cold, hard actuarial data, and perceived risk, which is what the human brain actually does with that data.
Which are two very different things.
Incredibly different. Think of objective risk as a raw beam of pure, brilliant white light cutting through a dark room. It is unadulterated statistical probability. But before a human being can actually see that light or process it or, make a medical decision based on it, that beam has to pass through a prism.
And the prism is the human mind.
Exactly. The moment the light hits the glass, it shatters. It refracts into a massive, complex spectrum of emotions, past memories, cultural trust, existential dread, and a whole host of deeply ingrained cognitive biases.
You cannot just hand a patient a raw statistic and expect them to see the pure white light. You have to understand how their specific prism is going to bend it. And that is our mission for this deep dive. We're exploring Chapter 7.6 of the Oxford textbook of Global Public Health, focusing entirely on risk perception and communication.
Which is so crucial, because whether you are a junior doctor securing informed consent, or a public health trainee designing a vaccination campaign, or just a clinical practitioner, understanding this refraction is foundational.
Because inaccurate judgments about risk by the public cause immense harm, right? Like we saw with the post-9/11 driving fatalities.
Yes, but inaccurate assumptions about those judgments by medical professionals cause just as much harm. When we sit in a clinic and assume a patient is just, bad at math or willfully ignoring our advice, we completely fail our mandate.
We end up treating a system failure as an individual failure.
Exactly. So to correct that, we are going to build a comprehensive conceptual framework today. We're going to explore how people estimate numbers, how they define what a hazard actually is, the internal blueprints or mental models they use to understand biological processes.
How those models drive their healthcare decisions.
Right. And finally, how we can engineer our clinical communications to actually cut through the noise and system impact.
So if our internal math is this broken, it makes you wonder, are we even doing the same math as the experts?
I mean, that is a constant complaint in the medical field. A doctor will look at a patient and think, why are you panicking about a 1 in a million side effect, but you totally refuse to wear a seatbelt?
Yeah, there is this massive gulf between expert statistical estimates and public perception. So to figure out why, we need to look at a landmark piece of behavioral research from 1978, the Lichtenstein study.
Oh, this study is absolutely brilliant. Researchers went to Eugene, Oregon, and worked with members of a local civic group, fundamentally testing the architecture of human judgment.
What exactly did they ask them to do?
They asked these everyday individuals to estimate the annual number of deaths in the United States from 30 different causes.
Like what kind of causes?
We are talking about everything from botulism and tornadoes to motor vehicle accidents, asthma, strokes, a huge range. But what makes this study brilliant isn't the trivia of the hazards themselves, but the psychological trap the researchers laid. They tested the public's perception using two completely different cognitive tasks.
Right, and the results revealed a tale of two entirely different human brains. Because the first task asked them to judge relative risk.
Right. The researchers would pair two hazards together, say asthma and botulism, and simply ask the participant which of these kills more people and by what ratio.
What did they do?
When asked to do this, the public was surprisingly accurate. Their internal scale of relative risk was highly consistent. They generally knew which threats were structurally larger than others, and the ratios they guessed were logically sound.
So they actually possess a highly functional internal intuition for comparing dangers.
They do. But then came the second task. The researchers asked for absolute risk. They wanted the actual concrete number of deaths per year for each hazard.
And this is where the human brain just completely short circuits.
Totally falls apart. Because to give the participants a starting point, the researchers anchored them.
Explain anchoring for those who might not know.
Sure. So for one group of people, they said, okay, to give you a sense of scale, 50,000 people die from auto accidents every year. Now, based on that, guess the annual fatalities for the rest of the list.
Okay, that makes sense. Give them a baseline.
Right. But for another group, they used a completely different anchor. They said, 1,000 people die from electrocution every year. Now, guess the rest.
And the outcomes of that simple framing change were staggering, weren't they?
Mind-blowing. When people were anchored with the high number, the 50,000 auto fatalities, their guesses for all the other risks were 2 to 5 times higher than the group anchored with the 1,000 electrocution fatalities.
Wait, really? 2 to 5 times higher across the board?
Yes. Their entire perception of absolute reality shifted based on a completely arbitrary starting number. Furthermore, they exhibited a massive cognitive bias known as compression.
What does that mean, compression?
Well, the actual real-world statistical frequency of those 30 causes of death varied by 6 orders of magnitude. But the human guesses, they only spanned 3 to 4 orders of magnitude.
Oh, I see. So human risk perception is essentially a rubber band. We intrinsically know which end is thicker and which end is thinner. That is our solid grasp of relative risk.
Exactly.
But if you pull that rubber band from a different starting point, if you anchor it differently, the entire shape stretches and compresses out of proportion. We wildly overestimate the incredibly small risks, and we drastically underestimate the massive chronic risks.
The rubber band maintains its sequence, but the absolute distances between the points warp completely. So we have to ask the neurobehavioral question, why does this happen? Why do we overestimate the small risks?
Right. What's the mechanism there?
This brings us to the availability heuristic. Our brains did not evolve to act like actuarial tables. When we try to estimate the probability of an event, we subconsciously judge it based on how easily and how vividly instances of that event come to mind.
Meaning media coverage totally hijacks our biological risk perception.
100%. A tornado or a horrific homicide is highly vivid. It is plastered across every screen, highly reported, and therefore highly available in our memory.
While something like asthma fatalities, on the other hand, are quiet, private, and rarely make the evening news.
Precisely. Our brains automatically assume the vivid events are statistically more common because they are easier to recall.
What is most troubling from a clinical communication standpoint is that tracking frequency is a subconscious automatic process. Like in the Lichtenstein study, didn't the researchers actually try to warn the participants about the availability bias?
They did. They explicitly told them, be careful, the media overreports homicides and underreports strokes, so keep that in mind.
And it didn't help.
Not at all. The participants still could not correct their judgments. You cannot simply tell a patient you are biased by the news and expect their cognitive framework to self-correct.
Because the physiological response to a vivid, available memory, like the spike in cortisol, the racing heart, that overrides the rational correction.
Exactly. You cannot logic your way out of a physiological response.
So we have to be incredibly careful about how we, as medical professionals, judge the public's actions based on this. We often look at the public's decisions, deem them mathematically illiterate, and assume we understand their entire risk equation.
Which is incredibly arrogant.
Right. Let's circle back to that post-9/11 driving example, because the textbook highlights this as a profound warning about clinical arrogance and evaluative standards.
Yeah. Experts looked at the historical statistics that showed driving per mile is vastly more dangerous than commercial aviation. Therefore, when the public chose to drive after 9/11, the public was deemed irrational.
But we cannot judge a person's risk perception purely from their risk decisions without understanding the broader context. The experts' analysis was actually deeply flawed, very flawed, because the historical driving data the experts used to prove the public wrong included drunk drivers, reckless teenagers, and the elderly driving at night. It was an aggregate statistic.
Right. It wasn't specific to sober, hyper-vigilant adults taking a cautious family road trip in the middle of the day.
Exactly. Furthermore, the aviation system was in absolute chaos at the time. Planes had literally been grounded. We did not have valid safety statistics for flying in that exact moment of unprecedented crisis.
And beyond the raw mortality statistics, a risk decision includes factors entirely outside of pure health outcomes, doesn't it?
Always. The public was factoring in the extreme hassle, the severe delays, the cost, and the profound emotional dread of being trapped in an airport during an active national security crisis.
The lesson for public health practitioners listening is clear. Do not look at a patient's choice and immediately assume they have miscalculated the mathematical risk. They might be calculating a completely different equation than you are. That is exactly right, which transitions perfectly into how people handle probabilities, especially when emotions are running high. We know people struggle with numeric scales, but it is not just a lack of mathematical education. People's probability judgments are highly vulnerable to transient emotions.
Transient emotions, like what?
Well, research shows a vital neurobehavioral link here. Anger actually increases optimism about risk, whereas fear decreases it.
Wait, anger makes you more optimistic.
Yes. If you are communicating a public health warning to a population that is angry, perhaps because they feel a toxic hazard was imposed on them unjustly by a corporation, or a mandate was forced on them by a government, they will actually judge their probability of surviving or avoiding the risk higher than if they were simply afraid.
Wow. So their emotional state actively modulates their mathematical computation.
Precisely. We see these fascinating quirks across different demographics, especially teenagers. There's this massive societal assumption that teenagers engage in risky behavior like reckless driving or unprotected sex because they suffer from a delusion of invulnerability.
Right, we assume their brains just don't believe bad things can happen to them.
But the data completely contradicts that societal assumption. When you actually sit down and elicit probability judgments from adolescents, they do not think they are invulnerable. In fact, many teenagers significantly exaggerate their probability of premature death compared to adults.
Really? They think they're more likely to die early.
Yes. Furthermore, their probability judgments are actually predictive. Teens who estimate a higher probability of experiencing life events like pregnancy or arrest over the next 1 to 5 years are statistically more likely to actually experience those events.
So they know their environment, and they know their behaviors. The issue isn't that they don't see the risk. The issue is how they define and process it.
Exactly.
Which means if our internal math is being warped by anchoring, availability, and transient emotions, it assumes we're all at least trying to measure the same thing. But what if the definition of the threat itself is a moving target?
That is the pivotal question of qualitative assessment.
Right. When a toxicologist measures a hazard, they're counting bodies. But is that actually what the public is measuring when they feel afraid?
Rarely. What do we actually mean when we say the word risk? To an epidemiologist, risk usually means average annual fatalities. It is a strict body count. But risk is not a monolithic concept to the human mind.
It could mean so many things.
Exactly. Does risk mean sudden death? Does it mean a long, painful morbidity? Does it mean permanent trauma? Does it mean life years lost? A disease that kills an 80-year-old and a disease that kills an 8-year-old might have the exact same statistical mortality rate, but society weighs the life years lost completely differently.
Right. Every single definition of risk contains an implicit ethical position.
Exactly. And when experts in the public clash, it is almost always because they are operating under entirely different definitions of what the threat is. Let's look at catastrophic potential.
Okay, break that down for us.
In early studies, experts equated risk strictly with routine average annual fatalities. But laypeople had a much broader, more dynamic definition. They included the expectation of what happens in a non-average year if a system completely spins out of control.
So if an expert says a nuclear power plant is safe because the average annual fatalities are 0, but the public considers the risk incredibly high, the public is not necessarily mathematically illiterate.
No, they are evaluating the catastrophic potential, the idea that if a rare anomaly occurs, it could render an entire city uninhabitable for centuries.
They're looking at the variance, the tail end of the distribution, while the expert is looking at the median.
Yes, they are disagreeing because they are measuring two entirely different things on two entirely different scales.
This clash was formalized beautifully in what behavioral scientists call the psychometric paradigm, right?
Yes, researchers wanted to know how the human brain actually maps out different hazards. So they had people rate various risks across a multitude of features. They ran a complex factor analysis and found that the vast majority of our risk perception can be explained by just two primary dimensions.
Okay, so imagine two axes on a graph that define our entire psychological risk space. What's the first dimension?
The first dimension is the unknown factor. The brain asks, is this risk new? Is it unobservable? Are the biological effects delayed? is my exposure to it involuntary?
So things like DNA technology, food coloring, and invisible chemical pesticides score very high on the unknown factor. They feel insidious because our senses cannot detect them.
Exactly. And the second dimension is the dread factor. Is this hazard certain to be fatal to large numbers of people simultaneously if things go wrong? Do I have zero personal control over the outcome?
So nuclear power and commercial aviation score incredibly high on the dread factor. So keeping those two dimensions in mind, the unknown factor and the dread factor, let's look at one of the most infamously terrible communication strategies in the history of public health. I call it the peanut butter fallacy.
Oh, yes. It is the ultimate textbook example of an invalid, mathematically arrogant risk comparison.
You will have an industry spokesperson or a technical expert trying to calm the public about, say, living near a newly constructed chemical or nuclear plant, and they will look at their actuarial tables, step up to the podium and say, statistically, living next to this plant for 50 years carries the exact same 1 in a million risk of premature death as eating a single tablespoon of peanut butter.
Because peanut butter contains trace amounts of a naturally occurring carcinogen called aflatoxin.
Right. Therefore, the expert argues if you happily eat peanut butter, it is totally irrational for you to protest the plant.
And that argument infuriates the public, and rightly so. It is a completely tone-deaf insult to their psychological reality.
Because the expert is only comparing the raw, isolated probability of death.
Exactly. But the public evaluates risk using the psychometric paradigm. Eating peanut butter is entirely voluntary. Living downwind of an industrial reactor feels imposed and involuntary.
Aflatoxin is familiar. Industrial radiation is unknown and invisible.
Choking on or being poisoned by peanut butter affects one single person. A reactor meltdown has massive dread and catastrophic potential for the entire region. To equate the two simply because the raw mortality statistic aligns is a massive failure of empathy. It ignores the actual dimensions of human risk space.
It is like telling someone that being pushed out of an airplane with a parachute is exactly the same psychological experience as taking a nap on your couch simply because your heart rate might end up the same at some point during the day.
That's a perfect way to put it. It strips away the entire context of human experience. But this disconnect doesn't just happen with sweeping societal risks like nuclear power. It happens right in the exam room, largely due to ambiguity in how we, as professionals, define an event to our patients.
Let's look at a national survey that was given to U.S. college students about HIV transmission. The survey asked, how likely do you think it is that a person will get the AIDS virus from sharing plates, forks, or glasses with someone who has AIDS?
On the surface, to a clinician, that seems like a perfectly straightforward question. But when researchers actually unpacked how the students were answering it, they found utter cognitive chaos.
What were they inferring?
The students were inferring wildly different scenarios. 39% assumed the question meant sharing a glass on a single occasion. 28% assumed it meant sharing utensils routinely every single day for months.
Wow. When public health communicators are ambiguous, the audience is forced to fill in the blanks. They have to guess the dose.
And if the patient is guessing the dose, any data you collect on their risk perception is fundamentally useless.
Which leads to a terrifying cognitive bug, cumulative risk blindness. We are absolutely terrible at understanding how risks compound over repeated exposures. Our brains just do not grasp exponential growth.
This is a vital point for any clinician dealing with behavioral health, particularly regarding seatbelts, daily medication adherence, or sexually transmitted infections.
Give us an example.
If you ask teenagers to judge the risk of HIV transmission from a single unprotected encounter, they might guess around 10%. From a strictly biological standpoint, that is vastly overestimated.
Right.
But then, if you ask them to judge the risk of transmission from 100 unprotected encounters with that same person, their median estimate only goes up to about 25%.
Wait, if the single encounter is 10%, 100 encounters should mathematically approach near certainty. Why wouldn't their guess shoot up to 90 or 95%?
Because the human mental model doesn't naturally use additive or exponential math for invisible threats. Evolutionary psychology suggests we view vulnerability as an absolute binary state tied to our identity.
Like, either I am the kind of person who is vulnerable to this, or I am not.
Exactly. They don't see risk as a physical mechanism that accumulates sequentially. They think, well, if it didn't happen the first time, it means I'm safe, so it's not going to happen the 100th time.
This is why teens might assume they're naturally infertile if they have unprotected sex once and don't get pregnant, which then encourages further unprotected sex.
Precisely. We cannot just communicate the single exposure risk. We have to actively teach the mathematical concept of cumulative probability.
This idea of how people think it works is the perfect bridge into understanding the architecture of belief. We have seen that when there are blanks in the information, people fill them in. But where are they getting the blueprints to fill in those blanks?
They are relying on intuitive theories. They're building what cognitive psychologists call mental models.
Explain what a mental model is for us.
A mental model is simply the internal map a person uses to understand how a biological or environmental process actually works from cause to effect. It is vital to understand that laypeople usually have highly logical, functional mental models. They use them constantly to generate options and predict outcomes in their daily lives.
So they aren't just acting randomly.
Not at all. The catastrophe occurs when their deeply logical mental model contains a fundamental structural flaw, a bug in the code. If the foundational premise is flawed, the perfectly logical conclusion will result in incredibly dangerous behavior.
The ultimate example of this from the text is the radon disconnect. Let's set the stage here. Radon is a colorless, odorless, naturally occurring radioactive gas that seeps up from the soil into basements.
Right.
Public health agencies spend millions of dollars on campaigns urging homeowners to buy incredibly cheap test kits to see if their home has high radon levels.
Yeah.
But compliance is notoriously abysmal. People simply refuse to test their homes.
And for years, public health officials just assumed people were lazy, financially constrained, or simply didn't care about their lung cancer risk.
But when behavioral scientists finally sat down and actually elicited the public's mental models, they found something astonishing.
Yeah.
The public knew what radon was. They knew it was a gas, and they knew it was radioactive.
But in the public's mental model, the word radioactive was inextricably linked to events like the Chernobyl disaster or toxic nuclear spills. To the layperson, radioactivity means permanent, irreversible contamination.
Put yourself in the homeowner's shoes. You think, if this invisible radioactive gas is already in my house, everything I own is permanently glowing, the damage is permanently done to my lungs, I am doomed. So why on earth would I take a test just to confirm that my house is ruined and worthless? There's absolutely nothing I can do about it.
The decision not to test is entirely perfectly logical based on their internal blueprint.
So what was missing from their blueprint?
What their mental model lacked was one specific, crucial scientific mechanism: rapid decay. Radon progeny have incredibly short half-lives. The scientific reality is that if you install a simple ventilation fan to stop the intrusion of the gas from the soil, the existing radon decays and disappears from the air incredibly rapidly.
So the problem is completely reversible.
Entirely. But because the public didn't have the concept of rapid decay in their mental model, their logical output was inaction.
So instead of public health officials just shouting, radon is bad, test your house, louder and louder, they needed to specifically target the concept of decay and reversibility. They had to perform a targeted conceptual repair.
Exactly. But you cannot repair a mental model until you accurately map it. This is why the clinical methodology of eliciting these models is so important. You do not use multiple choice surveys.
Why not surveys?
Surveys force the patient into the expert's predefined framework. They don't reveal how the patient actually thinks. Instead, clinicians and researchers use open-ended, non-judgmental interviews based on influence diagrams.
An influence diagram is basically a complex flowchart of causality, correct?
Yes. The experts first map out the formal scientific process. For example, exposure to soil gas leads to concentration in the living space, which leads to inhalation, which leads to a radioactive dose in the lungs, which leads to cellular mutation and disease.
Okay, so that's the expert map. Then what?
The interviewer then sits down, asks the patient open-ended questions, and just lets them talk. Tell me everything you know about radon. The researcher then maps the patient's beliefs onto the expert diagram. This allows us to see exactly where the patient's map diverges from the clinician's map.
Like maybe the patient knows it's a gas, but they think it only affects plants.
Or maybe they think it contaminates the blood rather than the lungs. Once you find the specific divergence, you design your clinical intervention solely around fixing that one specific bug.
Once that mental model is built, whether it is perfectly accurate or totally full of bugs, how does it translate into a real-world choice? How does a patient actually decide whether to take a supplement, undergo an invasive procedure, or accept a newly developed vaccine?
To understand the mechanics of choice, behavioral scientists use expectancy value models and decision trees. The foundational premise is that people make decisions by multiplying the likelihood of a consequence happening by its desirability or its valence.
Let's visualize a discrete choice using a decision tree. Imagine a male patient trying to decide whether to take a dietary supplement called saw palmetto for benign prostatic hyperplasia, essentially, an enlarged prostate.
Okay.
The decision tree starts with the initial branch. Take the supplement or don't take it. From there, it branches out into uncertain events. Will it actually reduce my symptoms? Will it cause gastrointestinal side effects?
Right. And from those events, it branches into the final outcomes. And those outcomes aren't just clinical. They include the physical health impact, yes, but also the dollar cost, the daily hassle of taking a pill, and maybe even the self-image impact of relying on a supplement to function.
What is profound about mapping decisions this way is what it reveals about the deep psychology of action versus inaction.
Oh, this is fascinating. A study asked a group of teenagers to think about accepting a risky option like drinking alcohol at a party, and then asked a separate group to think about rejecting that exact same option.
Logically, from a mathematical standpoint, these are two sides of the identical coin, right?
Exactly. The biological consequences of drinking are the same whether you frame it as an acceptance or a rejection. But psychologically, they trigger completely different processes. When asked to think about accepting a risk, people immediately list significantly more consequences and significantly more bad consequences than if they are asked to think about rejecting it.
Action is inherently more evocative than inaction. Taking a physical step feels viscerally more dangerous than standing still, even if standing still means you are standing on train tracks.
This leads us directly to the concept of omission bias and opportunity costs. In human psychology, foregone benefits are much less visible than direct consequences. We fixate heavily on the risks of commission, the active choice to do something, while remaining practically blind to the risks of omission, the passive choice to do nothing.
This has massive daily clinical application, especially when we talk about vaccine hesitancy. You have intelligent, caring parents who will hyperfixate on the direct, immediate risks of a vaccine.
Right. They read about a 1 in a million chance of an adverse allergic reaction, and that feels like an active choice to harm their child. They feel responsible.
But they completely neglect the indirect, statistically much higher risk of omitting the vaccine, which is a measles outbreak that could hospitalize or kill their child. The decision frame they're using completely hides the opportunity cost of inaction.
In their mind, doing nothing is the neutral, safe default state. We have to reframe the decision tree during the consultation so that inaction is clearly presented as an active, highly consequential choice.
That is the ultimate clinical challenge. We know their mathematical estimates are warped by anchoring and availability. We know their definitions of risk are clouded by dread and catastrophic potential. We know their mental models are missing key mechanisms, and their decision trees are severely tilted by omission bias.
So how do we actually talk to them? How do we create and evaluate communications that actually work in the real world?
The core premise of the textbook here is revolutionary, honestly. It argues that risk communications must be treated with the exact same scientific rigor as medical interventions.
Which makes perfect sense. You would never give a patient an untested, unproven pharmaceutical drug, so why on earth would you give a patient an untested warning label or an untested public health broadcast?
Engineering a successful message starts with selecting the right information, a process known as normative analysis. We have to overcome what behavioral scientists call the information supply curve.
Yes. There is a massive temptation among medical experts to tell the patient absolutely everything. The expert thinks, to protect myself legally and ethically, I will just dump the entire medical textbook on them and they can sift through it and figure it out.
This causes catastrophic cognitive overload.
Yeah.
It buries the critical, life-saving facts under a mountain of trivial data.
The text uses the carotid endarterectomy example to illustrate this perfectly.
Right. This is a major invasive surgery where doctors scrape plaque out of the main artery to the brain to reduce the risk of future strokes. But it is an intense procedure with dozens of potential side effects listed in the medical literature.
If you list them all, the patient panics. So researchers used a specific technique called value of information analysis to figure out what patients actually needed to hear to secure true informed consent.
How do they do that?
They modeled hypothetical patients who wanted the surgery. Then they introduced the side effects one by one, asking the patient, would knowing this specific side effect change your mind about having the surgery?
And what do they find?
Out of dozens of possible complications, like bruising, localized pain, minor infections, they found that only 3 were statistically significant enough to actually flip a patient's decision from yes to no.
Only 3. What were they?
The risk of death, the risk of stroke during the surgery itself, and the risk of permanent facial paralysis.
The lesson is so clear. Prioritize the data that changes the math. Yes, you have a legal and ethical obligation not to hide anything, but your frontline communication must prioritize the handful of facts that actually alter the patient's decision tree.
Because if you spend 20 minutes talking about minor bruising, they are going to zone out and miss the part about facial paralysis.
Part of that prioritization includes transparently communicating uncertainty. It is a persistent myth in public health that admitting uncertainty destroys your authority and trust.
In fact, quantifying uncertainty builds immense credibility. A great example from the text is communicating the risks and benefits of oral contraceptives. We shouldn't just vaguely say, it might affect your lifespan.
We can say, based on massive meta-analyses, that it alters life expectancy somewhere between minus 80 days to plus 4 days. And we can tell them that the research base is so massive that no future study is ever going to significantly change those bounds.
Exactly. We are giving them the exact mathematical parameters of the unknown.
But it is not just about what you say, it is about how it physically looks on the page. We have to talk about formatting and access. Researchers did a study on methylene chloride paint strippers.
Which is a highly toxic, dangerous chemical.
Right. The product label had a thick paragraph explaining how to use it safely. And buried right in the middle of that dense paragraph were the critical steps to avoid severe toxic exposure and respiratory failure.
This is where we look at visual search patterns. Human beings do not read safety warnings like they read novels. They scan. They look at bold headings, they read the first bullet point, and then their eyes skip to the very end.
And the study showed that because the life-saving information was hidden in the middle of a block of uniform text, only readers with highly specific, exhaustive search patterns ever found it.
A formatting isn't just about aesthetics or making things look pretty. It is about accessibility. If the design of the label doesn't match the natural, lazy visual search pattern of the human eye, the information is effectively invisible.
So how do we know if our message is actually working before we release it? The FDA has established a gold standard, a 3-part test for evaluating any risk communication. Before you release a national broadcast or print a warning label, it has to pass these 3 criteria.
First, needs. Does the communication actually contain the specific information the recipient needs to make a decision? Not what the expert thinks they need, but what the recipient's mental model requires to fix the bug-like explaining rapid decay for radon.
Okay, second.
Second, access. Can the user actually find that information given their normal, everyday visual search patterns?
And the third.
Third, comprehend. Can they understand the information with a reasonable amount of cognitive effort? Does it use plain language? Does it actively avoid medical jargon?
Here is the hard truth for the medical community. Testing is mandatory. Untested communication is medical malpractice in the realm of public health.
It really is. If you put out a brochure and the public fails to understand the risk, that is an expert failure to communicate. It is not a public failure to comprehend. You did not calibrate your instrument to the patient.
To ensure that calibration actually happens, institutional communication requires 4 distinct pillars. You need a highly coordinated team of 4 types of experts.
Yes. First, you need subject matter specialists, the toxicologists, the epidemiologists, who identify the biological risk. Second, you need risk and decision analysts who can take that biological data and estimate how it impacts the specific decisions people have to make.
Okay, that's 2.
Third, you need behavioral scientists who can map the public's mental models, identify the bugs, and formulate the exact phrasing needed to correct them. And fourth, you need communication practitioners who know how to manage the media channels, design the typography, and gather feedback.
You cannot mix those roles up. If you let a graphic designer alter the medical facts just to make the brochure look prettier, people die. But if you let a lab scientist write the public brochure based on what they guess the public wants to hear, people also die because the message will be utterly incomprehensible.
Everyone has to stay in their lane, working together to engineer a precise intervention.
If we step back and look at this entire journey, from the illusion of anchoring numbers to the structure of mental models and the engineering of messages, the ultimate takeaway is about the severe limitations of pure data. Perfectly precise scientific risk estimation is absolutely powerless if it cannot cross the gap of human meaning.
It brings us right back to that prism we talked about at the beginning. You can generate the purest, brightest beam of statistical white light in the world. You can have the best p-values, the largest sample sizes, the most robust epidemiological surveillance data. But if you just shine it blindly at a wall, it scatters.
When a public health mandate fails, or when a patient refuses a life-saving treatment, the solution is almost never just give them more data. The solution is empathy. It is taking the time to understand the specific shape, the specific angles, and the specific flaws of the mental model receiving that light. You have to align your communication with their psychological reality.
That empathy is the absolute essence of effective global public health. And now, to ensure these concepts are fully consolidated for the medical professionals listening, we're going to transition into our learning reinforcement phase.
All right, before we wrap up, let's lock in some of the most critical takeaways. I'm going to throw a few scenarios at you from the textbook, and let's see if we can distill the core answers for the listeners to review.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Let's look back at Lichtenstein's 1978 study in Eugene, Oregon. Which specific type of judgment was entirely derailed by framing and anchoring cues? Take a second to think about it.
That was absolute risk judgments, asking them to estimate the exact number of deaths. Relative risk judgments remain largely consistent regardless of framing. You can review this in section 7.6 under quantitative assessment.
Okay, what about the psychometric paradigm of risk perception? What were the two primary dimensions that explain the majority of variance in how the public perceives hazards? Think on that one.
The unknown factor, which measures how new, delayed, or unobservable a risk is, and the dread factor, which measures its catastrophic potential and fatality. This is detailed in section 7.6, Dimensions of Risk.
When adolescents judge the risk of acquiring an STI, what specific cognitive error do they frequently make regarding multiple exposures? Just take a beat.
They exhibit severe insensitivity to cumulative risk. They view vulnerability as an absolute state rather than understanding the exponential growth of risk over repeated sex acts. Review section 7.6, Cumulative Risk.
In the context of mental models, what was the specific misunderstanding that led homeowners to erroneously conclude that radon testing was pointless?
Homeowners understood radon was radioactive, but equated radioactivity with permanent contamination. They failed to understand the short half-life and rapid decay that makes mitigation highly effective. This is found in section 7.6, Mental Models of Risk Processes.
When applying value of information analysis to secure informed consent for a carotid endarterectomy, researchers found that out of dozens of side effects, how many were actually likely to change a patient's decision? Give that a thought.
Only 3: death, stroke, and facial paralysis. Communication should always prioritize information that impacts the actual decision. Review section 7.6, Selecting Information.
Finally, according to the evaluation standards for risk communication, what are the 3 criteria a communication must meet to be considered adequate by the FDA?
It must include the information recipients need, afford them access based on normal search patterns, and allow them to comprehend it with reasonable effort. This is covered in section 7.6, Evaluating Communications.
Remember, the next time you find yourself frustrated because a patient or the public seems to be completely ignoring the pure white light of your medical data, stop and ask yourself, have you looked at their prism? Have you taken the time to understand how their fears, their memories, and their mental models are bending the light? Because until you understand the refraction, you aren't really communicating. You're just shining a light into the void.